Rome ruled 70 million people, with a few thousand bureaucrats. Think about that for a moment. A single modern city government employs more administrators than Rome used to run a fifth of the human race. And yet the empire held for centuries. So here is the question that should bother you. If military force alone explains empires, how did a few thousand officials hold 70 million people together across 5 million square kilometers? The answer rewrites what we think we know about how power actually works. Welcome to No History. We examine how power actually worked, not how it claimed to work. The story most of us absorbed goes something like this. A powerful ruler raises an army. The army conquers neighbors. The conquered pay tribute. The cycle repeats until the empire is too large to defend. Then a stronger enemy arrives and tears it down. It's a clean story. It feels like physics. Bigger force wins. Bigger empire eventually meets bigger force. And there's enough truth in it to make it stick. Rome did conquer. Persia did conquer. The Mongols absolutely conquered. But when you look at what actually held empires together and what actually broke them, the military story falls apart almost immediately. Because the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history at roughly 24 million square kilometers, collapsed within a century of its peak. The four successor khanates that emerged after its fragmentation, the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the West, were squabbling over the ruins within 2 generations of Genghis Khan's death. Meanwhile, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, built under Cyrus the Great starting around 550 BCE, ran for roughly 220 years until Alexander's conquest in 330 BCE. That span of fiscal and administrative stability, achieved through a model of distributed governance and fixed tribute, is what makes it worth comparing to Rome's eventual unraveling. Pure military power doesn't explain the difference. Something else does. Around 550 BCE, a Persian king named Cyrus the Great began expanding what would become the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. And here is where the standard story breaks down. Cyrus didn't just conquer, he negotiated. When he absorbed new territories, he offered local elites something unusual for the ancient world. Keep your position, keep your religion, keep your administrative customs. Pay your taxes and govern your own people. That offer had a precise logic to it. An elite who keeps their position under a new ruler has every reason to cooperate. An elite who has been stripped of power has every reason to resist. Cyrus was reducing the cost of control by making cooperation the rational choice, not through generosity, but through calculation. In 539 BCE, Cyrus captured Babylon, one of the most powerful cities on Earth. He didn't loot the temples. He didn't deport the population. He walked in, made offerings to the Babylonian god Marduk, and declared himself the legitimate successor of Babylonian kings. That document, the Cyrus Cylinder, is one of the oldest surviving policy statements in human history. It isn't a war trophy, it's an administrative announcement. Issued in the first year of Cyrus's reign over Babylon, It was designed to be read aloud in temples across the city, signaling to every priest, merchant, and local official that the new ruler intended to work with the existing order, not demolish it. Some modern scholars have called it an early human rights document. That framing is probably anachronistic. What it actually records is something more precise, a ruler calculating that tolerance was cheaper than suppression, and putting that calculation in writing for an audience that needed reassurance, not inspiration. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, roughly a century after Cyrus's reign, recorded accounts of how Persian expansion worked in practice. Local customs preserved, local languages used in official records, local gods respected. His accounts are valuable, but they are retrospective, drawn from oral tradition and earlier sources, not contemporary observation. The Persepolis fortification tablets, clay administrative records excavated in the 20th century, corroborate this picture from the inside, recording ration payments to workers from at least a dozen different ethnic groups, each listed by their home region. This wasn't weakness. It was engineering. So what made this model work structurally? Start with the problem every empire faces. You have conquered territory 1,000 miles from your capital. You need taxes collected, roads maintained, disputes resolved, and potential rebellions suppressed. You cannot physically be everywhere. The Achaemenid solution was the satrapy system. Each province, called a satrapy, was governed by a satrap, often a local or regional figure with deep existing authority. The satrap collected taxes, maintained order, and reported upward. Cyrus's court didn't micromanage. It needed reliable flows of revenue and loyalty, and the satrapy system delivered both without requiring a large central staff. Critically, each satrapy paid a fixed annual tribute, negotiated upfront, not renegotiated every season. The central court knew exactly what revenue to expect. Satraps knew exactly what they owed. There was no ambiguity to exploit and no shortfall that required emergency measures. The system was predictable by design, and predictability is the foundation of every functional fiscal architecture. And to make information move fast enough to govern at that scale, Cyrus's successors built the Royal Road. Herodotus described the Royal Road stretching from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in modern Iran, a distance he estimated at roughly 1,600 to 1,700 miles. According to Herodotus, royal couriers could cover it in about a week using relay stations with fresh horses, though modern scholars debate the precision of these figures. The Greek historian was so impressed by the Persian courier system's reliability that his account of it has echoed through history. The famous phrase, "neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness," is often attributed to Herodotus's description of these royal messengers, though scholars debate whether the exact wording derives directly from his text or was a later formulation inspired by it. Either way, the phrase eventually found its way, centuries later, into use as an unofficial motto for the United States Postal Service. That's faster than most medieval European communication networks operating 1,000 years later. Speed of information was speed of control. Rome borrowed from this playbook more than most people realize. Roman citizenship was extended to conquered peoples over time. Local elites were absorbed into the Roman governing class. Provincial governors administered with considerable autonomy. The legions enforced, but the administrative apparatus, the tax collectors, the judges, the road maintainers, was largely local. The center set the rules. The periphery ran the day-to-day. Under Emperor Trajan in 117 CE, the empire reached its greatest extent, 5 million square kilometers, 70 million people, a figure that represents the scholarly consensus estimate, though ancient population counts carry inherent uncertainty. And that impossibly small central bureaucracy holding it together, because the system was designed so that it didn't need to hold everything directly. The mechanism was the same logic Cyrus had used. Don't try to control everything directly. Build a system where local actors govern themselves within your framework, pay into your treasury, and have more to gain from staying inside the empire than from leaving it. That's not brute force. That's a franchise model. And like any franchise, it worked as long as the central offer, stability, legal protection, access to Roman markets, was worth more than the cost of the taxes. So, what goes wrong? Follow the money. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was in a fiscal crisis that would have been recognizable to any modern economist. Military costs had outrun revenue. The empire was fighting on multiple frontiers simultaneously: the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates. Emperors needed to pay the legions, and the legions' loyalty was no longer guaranteed by ideology or citizenship. It had become transactional. Pay them well or lose them. Here is where the difference from the Achaemenid model becomes sharp. Persia's tribute system was fixed and distributed. Rome's military funding was centralized and elastic, which meant that when costs spiked, the center had to find new money fast. There was no distributed buffer. There was no fixed ceiling on what the military could demand. The solution Rome reached for was currency debasement. Reduce the silver content of the denarius. Mint more coins. Pay the soldiers. What followed was inflation. Prices for grain, for weapons, for labor, all climbed as the currency lost value. Local elites who had participated in the Roman system because it was profitable began to find it less attractive. The tax base eroded. The military became harder to fund, which required more debasement, which caused more inflation. The spiral tightened with each turn. The empire didn't fall when a stronger enemy arrived. It fell when the fiscal system that paid for everything stopped functioning. The legions that had held the frontiers for 3 centuries became unreliable not because they were outfought, but because they weren't paid reliably in currency worth anything. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 CE, a period historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome cycled through dozens of emperors and claimants. Scholars count anywhere from 26 to 50 or more, depending on how usurpers, co-emperors, and regional claimants are tallied. Most died violently, many within months of taking power. The empire didn't lose to an external conqueror. It lost coherence from within, as provincial commanders began minting their own coins and declaring their own authority, rather than waiting for instructions from a capital that could no longer pay its own bills. And here is where the Achaemenid model looks different in a way that matters. The Persian satrapy system was built around fixed tribute assessments. Each province paid a set amount annually, in gold or silver, negotiated at the start of the arrangement. The central court wasn't constantly renegotiating or printing money. Revenue was predictable. Military costs were partly distributed to provincial authorities. When a border satrapy faced a threat, it fielded its own forces first. The center reinforced. It didn't replace. The difference wasn't military strength. It wasn't cultural superiority. It wasn't even better leadership. It was fiscal architecture. Empires don't collapse because enemies get stronger. They collapse when the internal system that funds loyalty, infrastructure, and administration stops working. The Achaemenid system made that kind of collapse structurally harder to trigger. Fixed tribute meant no debasement spiral. Distributed military responsibility meant no single point of fiscal failure. Cyrus the Great understood something that Rome's 3rd century emperors forgot, or perhaps never fully grasped. The cost of holding territory is determined by how much the people inside it want to stay. When you offer local autonomy, religious tolerance, and administrative continuity, you reduce the cost of control dramatically. When you strip those things away, through currency debasement, through broken promises, through extracting more than the system can sustain, you increase the cost until it exceeds what you can pay. And once that threshold is crossed, no army is large enough to reverse it. The Achaemenid Empire ran for over 2 centuries after Cyrus's death, administered through the same basic framework he established at Babylon in 539 BCE. Not because Persian kings were wiser than Roman emperors in every generation, because the structure they built made fiscal collapse much harder to trigger in the first place. The Persepolis fortification tablets, recording grain and wine rations distributed to workers across the empire during the reign of Darius I, roughly 20 to 35 years after Cyrus's death in 529 BCE, show a system still functioning on Cyrus's original administrative logic, even as Darius refined and expanded it. The empires that fell didn't lose their grip. They ran out of grip to maintain. If fiscal collapse brought down Rome's 70 million subjects, what made the Persian Empire's tax system different enough to sustain stability across its roughly 220 years span? The direction of the answer is clear. Fixed tribute, distributed costs, and local actors who had more to gain from cooperation than from resistance. The Cyrus Cylinder wasn't a moral document. It was a fiscal one. We examine how power actually worked, not how it claimed to work. What specific fiscal policy from Cyrus the Great's reign do you think Rome's 3rd century emperors should have copied? See you at the next dynasty.